Previously, we began to look at Matthew chapter 24 and noted that some of the verses that you find referenced by people today about things that are happening around the world today really do not fit the context of Matthew chapter 24. The chapter begins by the disciples pointing out to Jesus the beauty of the temple that is still under construction. In fact, that construction process, but not just of the temple, but of the surrounding buildings, was not finished until AD 64, over 3 decades after Jesus was crucified on the cross. And what Jesus says in Matthew chapter 24 and verse 2 is that there's going to be a time when not one stone is left upon another. That's devastating to somebody that's of Israel. So in verse number 3, when they leave the city of Jerusalem, go to the Mount of Olives, the disciples ask these questions. Tell us, when will these things be? And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? Jesus answers more than one question in this chapter. Now initially he's talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. And that answer to that question starts in verse 4, continues all the way to verse 35. And what he says is, you will hear of wars and rumors of wars, but do not be troubled. The end is not yet. That sounds different from what people are saying today. And then he says in verse number 7, nation rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom, famines, pestilence, earthquakes in various places. But that's just the beginning. That doesn't sound like what people are saying today either. In verse 9 and verse 10, he talks about the extent of the persecution they're going to face, not just imprisonment, but death. People are going to hate them for what they stand for and for what they believe. And then the statement's made in verse number 14, this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in all the world as a witness to all the nations. People say, well, that hasn't happened yet. Colossians chapter 1, the Apostle Paul said it did. Now, if I'm wanting to put Matthew 24 into the 21st century, I can tell Paul that he's wrong, but I really don't think that he was. It's an indictment upon what modern man has not done in our day and age about sharing that message with the world. Paul said in his day, they did that. And then Jesus said in verse 15, therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet standing in the holy place, it's verse 15, verse 16, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. You find that phrase, abomination of desolation, in Daniel 11 as well as Daniel chapter 12. What does it mean? There's a parallel account of this statement. Luke records it this way in Luke chapter 21. So what is that abomination of desolation? To what does it have reference? Luke 21, verse 20 and 21. When you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that its desolation is near. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Sound similar? The abomination of desolation, what is that? Armies around Jerusalem. Has that happened? Answer is yes. When did that happen? AD 70. Under General Titus, that Roman army eventually ransacked everything. The historian Josephus says the streets ran ankle deep in blood. Historians even beyond Josephus talk about the number of casualties, over 1 million. It was horrendous. So much so that when Jesus tries to describe the devastation, he uses the same kind of imagery that you find repeatedly used in the Old Testament. The sun's going to grow dark. The moon's not going to give its light. And people say, well, that's literal. Well, if that's literal, then it's already happened multiple times. Back in Isaiah chapter 13, it's in reference to the destruction of the Babylonian Empire. Ezekiel chapter 32, it's the destruction of Egypt. Now, the imagery is something, and every serious student of the Bible should know that there are figures of speech that are utilized in the Old Testament that Jesus actually uses in the New to remind people of things that they have heard over and over again after they actually heard all of their life. This will be a cataclysmic destruction of the inhabitants of Jerusalem. How do you describe it? He describes it in those celestial terms, just like others did about other kingdoms falling, other cities falling, in those similar illustrations utilized in the Old. You read through the rest of that first half of Matthew 24. He talks about definite signs that are actually going to take place. In fact, in verse 32 and 33, Jesus said, learn this parable from the fig tree. When its branch has already become tender and puts forth leaves, you know that summer is near. So you also, when you see all these things, know that it is near at the doors. What is? What's the question? The question's in reference to one stone being thrown down off of another and the temple being leveled. When you see all these things, know that it is near, even at the doors. What? The destruction of Jerusalem. The destruction of that temple. And in verse 34, Jesus said, "Assuredly I say to you, this generation will by no means pass away till all these things take place." This generation, not a future generation. So why do people have to miss that? Why do people have to pull that out of context? Well, he's not talking to the disciples. He's not. Go back and look at verse 4. "Take heed that no one deceive you." Verse 6, "You will hear of wars and rumors of wars. You should not be troubled." Verse number 9, "They will deliver you up to tribulation and kill you and hate you." Verse number 15, "Therefore when you see the abomination of desolation." You continue that same kind of idea in verse 23. "If anyone says to you, 'Look, here is the Christ,' or there, do not believe it." He even says in verse 20, "Pray that your flight may not be in winter or on the Sabbath." In verse 25, "I have told you beforehand." Verse 26, "Therefore if they say to you, 'Look, he is in the desert,' do not go out." Verse 32, "Learn this parable, that you know that summer is near." Verse 33, "When you see all these things." Then verse 34, "Surely I say to you, this generation will by no means pass away till all these things are fulfilled." And then in verse 36, there's a change. It doesn't sound the same. Because Jesus is giving them indications of what not to worry about, things that are going to happen, but then something very specific to look for before that temple is actually destroyed. And then he says this, because they're asking more than one question. Verse 36, "Of that day and hour no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, but my Father only." Then he says in verse 37, "But as the days of Noah were, so also will the coming of the Son of Man be. For as in the days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage until the day that Noah entered the ark," verse 39, "and did not know until the flood came and took them all away, so also will the coming of the Son of Man be." What's the difference in this, the answer that he gives beginning in this verse, in verse 36? No indications, no signs. In verse 38 and verse 39, they're going to be carrying on life as usual. They're not going to know. They did not know until the flood came. So is the coming of the Son of Man. They didn't know till the water, that flood, the rain started. It is something that has no sign. It's something that actually in verse 38 and verse 39 is a total surprise. Verse 42, "Watch therefore, for you do not know what hour your Lord is coming." He doesn't give them any indication. No signs involved. Verse 43, "Know this, that if the master of the house had known what hour the thief would come, he would have watched and not allowed his house to be broken into. If it had been known." You don't. So what's the takeaway? What's the application? Verse 45 through 47, "Be ready all the time. Be faithful all the time." Verse 44, "Therefore you also be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an hour you do not expect." It's a surprise, no signs given, it's totally unexpected. Now that being the case, when Jesus says it is a surprise, when Jesus says it's unexpected, when Jesus says no one's going to happen until it actually finally arrives, what about all these individuals that are saying, well, you've got all these prophecies in the Old Testament that point to what's actually going to happen right prior to Jesus' return? Well, here's the question. Is Jesus right? Because Jesus said totally unexpected, a surprise, no indications of it until it happens. Is Jesus right? or were the Old Testament prophets right? The way that people actually interpret the Old Testament prophets does not fit what Jesus actually says. Therefore, is it possible that people have been misinterpreting what these Old Testament prophets have been saying to try to come up with something that Jesus said nobody knows? Create some tremendously sensational kind of topics or movies. The problem is, it doesn't fit the context of Matthew chapter 24. What Jesus says in verses 4 through 35 deal with the destruction of Jerusalem. You can watch for these signs. And when you finally see those armies and that death grip around the city of Jerusalem, get out while you can. Because once that noose is tightened around the city, nobody escapes. Over 1 million perish. However, you're asking about when am I going to return? When's the end of the age of that day and hour? Nobody knows, not even the angels. Don't give you any kind of signs. It's something that's going to be a total surprise. It's something that's going to be totally unexpected. You're not going to anticipate it. You can't figure it out. Be ready all the time, as though each day were your last, which makes perfect sense. If it was possible for even Christians to figure out, well, we can know what week he's coming, we can maybe what year he's coming, well, we'll actually be more faithful that year than any maybe previous year, or we will be more energetic in sharing the gospel with people that last year than any previous year. That's not the way to live. That's not what Jesus says. That's not what the Bible directs. 2 answers are given in this chapter, and if you look at them and analyze them, it's obvious from verse 36 to the end of the chapter, no signs given, no indications. It's unexpected. It will take you by surprise. So somebody says, listen to what the Old Testament prophet said. Okay, so you're going to tell me that Jesus was wrong? I really think Jesus was right. So maybe if you're trying to tell me that the prophets all point to exactly when it's going to end, are you sure you're actually taking a look at those prophetic statements in the Old Testament correctly? Because Jesus says something different. Please keep things in context. Please make sure that what we are finding in Scripture is exactly what Scripture says, not what we want Scripture to say. Please stay safe. We'll talk again soon.